Picture this, it starts with a whisper. Not the rustle of fabric, not the creak of old wood, but something deeper, like breath caught in stone. You lie in bed, still as the portrait above the hearth, staring at the ceiling, while the candle burns itself into nothing. And then it comes again, a voice, low, careful, like it's afraid to wake the others. You sit up, you wait. The sound crawls back into your ears, sliding between the cracks in the wall. It calls your name. Your blood stills. You know the corridors have ears, that the palace walls remember things. They've seen kings weep, queens scheme, servants vanish. They've heard prayers and curses in the same breath, and now they speak to you. You try not to breathe too loudly, as if your own noise will drown them out. The voice is gentle at first. It doesn't command. It confides. It knows you. Not the prince they dress up for court. Not the boy who recites lineage and law in perfect rhythm. It knows the one underneath, the one no one sees. It tells you things you're not supposed to know. That your father sleeps with a dagger under his pillow. That your mother cries when you're not looking. That the council meets without you. That they laugh, that they lie, that they whisper in different tongues but with the same venom. And then it says something strange. Not a secret this time. Not a name, but a warning. They will come for you. You flinch. A trick of the mind, maybe. You heard one of the footmen say, your cousin went mad that way. Too many stories, not enough sunlight. You ask yourself if it's possible to think yourself into ruin. But you already know the answer, because it doesn't stop. The whispers come again the next night, and the next. Some nights they hum, lull you to sleep like lullabies that never belonged to your mother. Some nights they shout, they argue, they beg you to listen, to act. You stop eating with the others, stop sleeping through the night. You pace, you stare at corners and windowsills, searching for the breath in the stone. You know the others are watching. You hear them mutter behind closed doors. Touched by God, some say. Touched by madness, others whisper. It doesn't matter, because the walls have already chosen you. You begin to ask them questions. The voices, you don't know whose they are. Old kings? Forgotten soldiers? Spirits chained to forgotten crimes? You ask, and they answer. At first their answers feel strange, unsettling, but then they start to make sense. They help you connect the dots. They make the world clearer. They tell you not to trust the man who brings your wine. They tell you where your letters go when they're intercepted. They tell you which names to watch, which footsteps are too soft, which smiles are too wide. And the worst part is, they're never wrong. They are your only truth. One day, you speak back aloud, not in whispers, but in full sentences. You feel a kind of release, as if your tongue is finally free. A servant hears you and drops a tray. You don't even flinch. You simply turn and ask the wall what comes next. Because that's what this is now. You don't walk alone. You walk with them. You don't think alone. You wait for their echo. And when you close your eyes, you see the palace the way they describe it. Like a trap. Like a mouth waiting to bite. Like a stage built for betrayal. You used to feel alone. Now you're never alone. Sometimes you wonder if they're real. But then you remember. Your father spoke to paintings. Your grandfather spoke to ghosts. Your great-uncle locked himself in a chapel and claimed the Virgin Mary dictated policy. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. So you rise, robe dragging behind you, and press your ear to the wall once more. The stones are cool, the voice is waiting. And this time, it doesn't whisper. It tells you a name, a traitor. And you believe it, because you always do. You remember the first time the voice wasn't a whisper. It didn't slither. It didn't echo. It spoke. And not just to you, but through you. It filled your spine with something electric. Your skin went cold, your heart silent. And then, a sentence clear as breath beside your ear. The key is under the bishop's bed. No warning, no preamble, just that. You didn't understand why you believed it. You just did. You were only a boy, and yet you moved like someone under spell or scripture. Past midnight tapestries, down silent stairwells slick with wax and stone to the bishop's chamber door. It wasn't locked. No guard, no dogs. Just him, drooling in sleep, wrapped in fur and shame. You didn't look at him. You went straight to the bed, dropped to your knees and reached beneath. Your fingers found it. Cold, iron, ornate. The key. You left before he stirred. No one saw. And you never told. That night the voice didn't speak again. But something in you changed. A hook set in your ribs. A new gravity. And from then on, you were never quite alone. He was 11 when it happened. Not a man, not yet. Not in body, at least. But something in his eyes darkened after that night. The childish fog lifted. He no longer just heard the walls. He obeyed them. The next time the voice came, it was sharper, urgent. Move the knife in the Queen's dressing room. He did. No one noticed until the Queen reached for it and found only empty velvet, a blade gone missing, a blade that, a maid whispered later, was supposed to have been used. On whom no one ever admitted aloud. There was a brief flurry of panic, whispers of assassination. But then it passed, replaced by new scandals, new distraction. The blade was never found. He had buried it beneath the courtyard rosemary bush, exactly where the voice told him to. And again the voice fell silent, for days, sometimes weeks. Then came the next command, and the next, and he followed every one. Each time, the instructions seemed strange, small, meaningless. Rearrange the scrolls in the Chancellor's study, spill ink on the Chamberlain's map, break the hinge on the Eastern Library window. None of it made sense, until it did. 3 weeks after he jammed the library hinge, the King's brother attempted to sneak into the archives. The window didn't open. He was caught. 2 months after he spoiled the map, the kingdom's campaign to the north collapsed due to unexpected terrain. The Chamberlain was dismissed. He said nothing. Not to his tutors, not to his nursemaids, not even to the only friend he had, a mute stable boy who once gave him a wooden knight carved from leftover fence posts. The prince buried that toy under his mattress like a relic. The voice never spoke of it, so he never moved it. Some part of him still wanted to keep one thing untouched, but everything else? Fair game. The more he obeyed, the more it spoke. And the more it spoke, the more real it became. The voice wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in cracks of marble, in flickers of candlelight, in the twitch of someone's hand, just before they lied. It told him things about people they didn't know about themselves. Who was afraid? Who was sick? Who was plotting? Who was falling in love? And who was about to die? It didn't always speak in words. Sometimes it was just a pull, a heat behind his eyes, a sense that he should turn left, not right, look down, not up, wait 5 more seconds before entering a room. And when he obeyed, something terrible often happened to someone else. That didn't bother him anymore. What terrified him, more than anything, was the idea of not listening. Because the palace was full of games he hadn't been taught to play, of alliances he didn't understand, of older brothers whose laughter could slice just as deep as knives. And through it all, the adults kept patting his head, like a dull coin they weren't sure how to spend. But the voice saw him. The voice didn't pity him, it used him. And for a boy raised to feel invisible, being used was the closest thing to purpose. He didn't ask where the voice came from. He didn't care. All he knew was this. The first time he disobeyed, someone he loved would die. So he followed. Not like a soldier, like a believer. Because the walls had stopped whispering. They had begun to command. The palace was not designed for silence. Every footstep lingered. Every breath bounced. The stone was too hard. The walls too bare. The ceilings too high. The architects had built a kingdom of echoes, though they hadn't meant to. They wanted majesty, grandeur, intimidation. But what they accidentally created was something far stranger. A place where the past refused to stay dead. A place where every word, once spoken, kept circling back. The prince noticed it more than anyone else. He didn't walk through the corridors like a child. He moved like a shadow, listening, counting, remembering. He knew which steps creaked 2 seconds before a servant passed. He could tell if someone was lying just by how the echoes shifted when they answered. And sometimes, in the thickest part of night, he swore he could hear his own name, repeated not by a person, but by the architecture itself. He had once tested it, spoken his name aloud, just a whisper. It bounced off the stone, looped down the curved stairwell, and came back as something else, bent, dragged. Like his name had aged in the darkness before returning. He never did it again, but the echoes stayed. They were louder in certain wings of the palace, the old chapel abandoned after the Queen's last miscarriage, the guard tower no one used since lightning cracked its roof, the underground passage that led to the family crypt, sealed now, but never truly silent. When the prince walked those places, he didn't just hear echoes, he heard layers, words from another time, folded into the air like seams in cloth. Sometimes they were whispers of servants long gone. Sometimes they were things no one ever should have said aloud. He came to understand the palace not as a structure, but as a living thing. It had moods, it had preferences. Certain hallways invited him in, others pushed him out. The ones that welcomed him always had some secret waiting. An overheard conversation between generals, a forgotten letter half burnt in a hearth, a crack in a mural revealing initials carved beneath the paint. The palace gave him offerings, and the voice helped him understand them. At first, the boy had thought the voice lived in the palace, that it was the spirit of some long-dead king trapped in the walls, desperate to finish what he started. But now he wasn't so sure. The voice knew the palace, but it didn't belong to it. It was older, hungrier. It treated the palace like a tool, not a home, and the prince had become its favourite instrument. One day, walking a hallway that twisted just a little too far east, where a wall bowed inward like it was breathing, he heard something new. Not a command, not a whisper, a memory. He heard himself, his own voice from a year ago, repeating a phrase he had forgotten. "What do you want me to do?" It startled him. He stopped, stared at the wall, and said nothing. The echo answered anyway. More. He wasn't sure if that was the palace speaking, or the voice, but after that day, he began to notice the pattern. Every hallway that echoed in strange ways shared one trait. They were lined with portraits, paintings of ancestors, of generals, of royal children whose names were long erased, but whose eyes still followed from behind the cracked glaze. He studied them closely. Some of their faces had warped over time. Rain seeped in, frames rotted, oils ran, but still they watched. And when the boy stood before the right one, in the right light, at the right time, the voice grew louder. He began to suspect the portraits weren't just art, they were antennae. He asked the stable boy once, quietly, without looking at him, if he ever felt like the walls were listening. The boy, still mute after all these years, simply nodded. And that was the first moment the prince realised. Maybe the voice didn't speak to everyone, but it spoke to some. He wasn't the only one chosen, just the one who listened best. The palace didn't belong to his father, or to the dynasty carved in stone above the gates. It belonged to the echoes, and the echoes answered to something else. The voice had given him power, small at first but growing, and now the palace itself seemed to bend in his presence. Doors opened more easily. Servants forgot to challenge him. Guards turned their backs just long enough for him to slip through. He didn't need permission. He had presence. And the voice kept promising that presence would one day fill the whole kingdom. But first, there were more tasks and more hallways to walk. The echo was still speaking, still growing. And now, the prince had learned how to echo back. It didn't begin with him. The voice, the whispers, the strange way the walls seemed to listen and breathe and wait. No, that had always been part of the lineage. Madness didn't arrive at the gates one morning, uninvited. It had always lived inside. The court historians would never call it that, not openly. They'd say melancholy, spiritual intensity, a tendency toward religious obsession. But the palace knew the truth. The servants whispered it behind locked doors, with the candles snuffed out. The noble families knew it too. They just never said it, because to name the madness was to admit the throne sat atop it. There had always been signs. The king's great-grandfather, who insisted his left hand was possessed, and had it chained to the bedpost at night. The queen's cousin, who spoke in 3 languages he had never been taught. The uncle who refused to bathe because he claimed the water remembered things. And now, the prince. His madness came softly, like dusk seeping into the room, without anyone noticing. He didn't rant, he didn't scream. He listened. That was what unnerved the others the most, his silence. He was too still for a child, too patient. He would sit in the corners of banquets, watching the guests with unblinking eyes, as if studying a species not his own. And he smiled. Not a child's smile, not warmth. A smile like understanding something no one else did. A smile like someone who knew a secret too big to say aloud. The court physicians debated endlessly. Was it illness? Possession? The residue of inbreeding that had twisted too many noble bloodlines into knots? The queen said nothing. She rarely looked at the boy now. Not because she didn't love him, but because she did. And to love something that frightened you this much, that was a curse no crown could shield her from. The king dismissed the rumours. He's imaginative, he said. He's sensitive. But even he had begun to avoid walking past the prince's chambers at night. There were stories now, from the staff, that the boy could tell when someone was about to die, that he'd warned a nurse to wear gloves a day before she developed the plague rash. that a stable hand heard him speaking to someone through the fireplace, though no one was there. But the voice was there, always, and now it had begun to speak not just in the walls, but in blood. The prince had developed an obsession with the family portraits, not just studying them, but touching them, tracing the faces, whispering to them. He said one ancestor, a long-dead duke, who had poisoned his own sons, told him things in his sleep. He described details of the man's life that no books recorded. Once the prince painted a mural in his chamber, a family tree in red and black. But not just the official line, he added branches that had been pruned from the records. Bastards, madmen, those who died in locked towers. The king ordered it scrubbed off the walls. It didn't matter. The prince had already memorized it. There was something inside him that vibrated with every drop of shed blood. Madness was not a curse in his mind. It was an inheritance. The part no one could take away. And the voice had begun to say that maybe, just maybe, it was not madness at all. Maybe it was clarity. There were moments now when the boy's pupils dilated, as if he was seeing something beyond the room. He would pause mid-sentence, head tilted, and listen. And when he spoke again, it was often with words that didn't belong to him. Older, sharper, crueler. The queen began locking her doors. The guards started drawing straws to avoid night shifts near his chamber. And yet the prince remained quiet, smiling, patient. The court still presented him to the people on feast days, still dressed him in white and gold, and made him wave from balconies. The crowd always clapped, but with a murmur underneath, because something in the boy's gaze made them uneasy. It was not vacant, it was not sad, it was aware. He had begun to refer to himself not as I, but as we. A slip of the tongue, some said, but he never corrected it. The voice, or the voices, had merged with him now. There was no line anymore between self and sound, between his thoughts and what he was told. And in the private halls of the nobility, they started asking each other quietly, what happens when this boy becomes king? What happens when the crown sits on a head already so full of others? The prince stood in the long hallway again, beneath the portrait of the poisoned sons. He traced the edge of the frame, and he smiled. Not madness, he whispered. Memory. The walls in the palace were not walls, they were witnesses. At first glance, they looked like any other, painted with gold flourishes, draped in velvet, heavy with oil and soot. They echoed the footsteps of centuries, whispered the draughts of dying kings, carried the scent of roses no longer grown. But to the prince, they were never just walls. They had eyes, breath, pulse. They remembered. When he walked down the corridor near the east wing, he could feel them shifting, not physically, not visibly, but something in their presence tightened, like lungs holding air, like someone waiting just on the other side of silence. He no longer flinched at the sound of creaks in the floorboards, or murmurs through the plaster. The palace was full of servants, tutors, courtiers, guards, and yet the noises he heard didn't come from them. They came in the hours after midnight, when the world was supposed to be asleep, when no shoes should tap on stone, when no voices should drift above the nursery door. But they did, and they spoke to him. He had tested it once. Whispers tickled the base of his spine as he sat in the library, alone with a book about saints who burned alive for speaking too soon. The voices chattered like moth wings. He shut the book and said aloud, "If you're real, knock." He waited. Nothing. He felt stupid. Then the chandelier overhead trembled, just slightly, just enough to shift the shadows. He tried again. "What do you want?" No answer. Just a low hum, the sound of silence being strained. Eventually, he stopped asking questions out loud, not because he doubted, but because he didn't have to speak anymore. The voices answered thoughts, reacted to feelings, and sometimes they spoke before he had even considered the thing they warned him about. It became impossible to explain. He tried once, to a maid he trusted, a kind-eyed girl who used to sneak him sweets in the folds of her apron. He told her that the walls listened, that they knew things. She laughed gently, brushing his hair behind his ear. Then she was gone the next day. The prince was told she'd left of her own accord, but the walls told him otherwise. He stood outside her chamber that night and pressed his palm to the wood. Cold, still. But inside the walls, he could feel it. Not warmth, not blood, but memory. Like the walls had recorded the scream, the struggle, the moment she knew she'd spoken to someone she shouldn't. They watched her die, and then they told the prince. From then on, he listened more carefully, and the palace began to change around him. It started subtly. Guards he disliked were reassigned. Tutors who corrected him too harshly suddenly fell ill. Courtiers who mocked him behind his back found themselves without invitation. The prince never raised a hand, never said a word, but the walls knew, and the palace obeyed. He had come to understand something few ever did. Power in a place like this wasn't just about titles or armies or coins. It was about awareness. Who knew what, who saw what, and who the walls chose to speak to. The king didn't hear them. The queen refused to. But the boy who had always been too quiet, too still, too odd, had been chosen, or cursed. It was hard to tell the difference. He began to spend hours tracing the wallpaper, running his fingers over cracks that no one else noticed. He'd tap the same 3 spots on the baseboards each night before bed. Rituals, not superstition, communication. And the voices grew bolder. Sometimes they told him secrets, who was planning to leave, who had lied, which brother had stolen coins from the treasury, which uncle had looked at the throne too long during council. The boy never reacted with anger. He simply remembered, and the walls remembered with him. One night, as a storm howled against the palace, the voices spoke in unison. Not whispers, not gasps, but something more deliberate, like a choir reciting a vow. The prince sat upright in bed, unafraid. He knew the words weren't meant to frighten him. They were meant to prepare him. He is dying, they said. He didn't ask who. He already knew. The king's health had begun to fray. His hands shook at banquets. His lips lost colour in winter. His mind wandered in council. And the boy, the prince, had already seen it in the way the walls breathed differently near the throne room. The palace was bracing itself, waiting for the shift, waiting for him, because the walls did more than listen. They chose, and in their silence, in their drafts and groans and murmurs, they had crowned him long before any ceremony. The prince stood before the great mirror in the hall of ancestors. Behind him, rows of faces stared out from golden frames. Rulers, warriors, monsters. He touched the mirror's edge and whispered to the glass, "I hear you." The walls, without a sound, whispered back, "We've always heard you too." They no longer whispered. The voices that once danced like dust behind the walls began to push forward, creeping from the cracks in the ceiling and curling through the seams of the floorboards. They used to wait for silence, for the lull between footsteps, the hush of midnight. But now they spoke in daylight, in echoing corridors, in front of portraits that blinked when no one else was looking. They grew bolder. They called his name in the presence of others, softly, but not softly enough. And when the prince turned his head suddenly, in a room full of nobles, his eyes darting toward a pillar, a painting, a dark alcove in the corner, he could feel the stares, the way courtiers exchanged glances, the way the servants stiffened, the way his younger brother bit his tongue, as if holding back a laugh. But the voices didn't care. They no longer hid. They had nothing to fear. "You must act," they said one evening, in a dozen overlapping tones, young and old, male and female, human, and something else. The prince had stopped asking them where they came from. He knew now they weren't ghosts. Ghosts were memories. These were intentions. "What do you mean?" he asked, standing barefoot on the cold tiles of the throne room long after it had emptied. The wind outside whined through the arrow slits. Moonlight pooled like water across the velvet carpet. "He will die soon," they replied, but not soon enough. He didn't ask who they meant. The king had been fading. His crown looked heavier each time it touched his skull. His words slurred. He forgot names. Sometimes he forgot his own son. And yet he held on, not with strength but with something worse, paranoia. He kept the prince close, too close, a leash made of silk and suspicion. The boy had grown into a young man by now, taller, sharper, eyes that looked half asleep but saw too much. And the more he listened, the more the voices gave him. They told him who met in secret, who paid the baker with foreign coins, who carved false documents behind locked doors. Treason, real or imagined, it didn't matter, because he knew what to do with it. The voices guided him, and he began to speak more like them. Quiet, certain, detached. He learned how to speak a death sentence with a smile, how to dismiss a man in such a way that he never came back, and no one asked why. "You must act," they said again, and he did. He began to stage the palace like a play, rearranged which ministers sat where, reassigned guards, changed locks on doors. He moved himself into chambers once used by dead kings, and claimed it was for the view. No one dared question him, not openly. but he could feel the air turn thick with questions that never passed lips. One night, his mother entered his room without knocking. She stood by the window, her silhouette stiff, the moonlight framing her in silk. "I heard you talking," she said, her voice brittle. "I talk often," he replied without turning. There was no one else here. He smiled. "You never listen closely enough." She said nothing. The voices were silent too, but he could feel them behind her, watching her, testing her. She didn't last long after that. An illness, they said, something in the blood. It came quick, left quicker. Her body wasn't even cold before the palace had shifted again. New guards, new alliances, new absences. The voices approved. The prince no longer waited for guidance. He began to anticipate them, to finish their sentences. Their confidence fed his own, until he no longer knew where his thoughts ended and theirs began. There were nights he barely slept. He'd pace the corridors like a man chased by something invisible. Though he was never afraid, he felt charged, as if electricity lived beneath his skin, as if the marble beneath his bare feet hummed with secrets. Sometimes he'd press his ear to the walls and listen, not to hear, but to feel. A rhythm, a pulse. The voices had become him, and the kingdom noticed. They began calling him the Quiet Prince, the Pale Flame, the Whisperer. No one could agree on his nature, but they all agreed on one thing. He was not like the others. He did not laugh, he did not mourn, he did not bleed in public. He simply waited. And while he waited, the walls kept speaking. Not warnings now, but plans. Not suggestions, but strategy. Because the king still lived. And the king still suspected. He had begun to keep a dagger under his pillow, to mutter about betrayal in his sleep. The old man had once been feared, but now he feared everything. Especially the boy who did not speak unless it mattered. Especially the son who never asked for power, yet somehow seemed to hold it already. And behind the walls, behind the stone and timber and silk, the voices murmured in unison, their patience finally thinning. It's time. The body was still warm when they found it. A servant, young, quiet, invisible in the way palace servants must be, was discovered face down in the inner courtyard before dawn, his neck twisted in a way no fool could explain. His tray had shattered on the tiles beside him, and the silverware lay scattered like spilled bones. They said it was an accident, a slip in the dark, an unfortunate misstep on wet stone. But there was no rain the night before. The official story stayed. No inquiry, no alarm. The palace had learned to accept silence as an answer. And the prince, who had passed the same courtyard mere minutes before, said nothing at all. He merely kept walking. That was the first. The voices had been clear. He listens, they had warned. Too well. The servant had overheard things, fragments of a conversation not meant for mortal ears. He had stood still for too long outside the prince's chamber. He had flinched at the wrong moment when the prince turned his head. And that was all it took. The prince hadn't wanted blood, not in the beginning. But he had come to understand that safety was made from sacrifice. And the voices, his constant companions, knew when a thread had to be cut. They didn't speak in rage. They spoke in necessity, in tidiness. The body was removed before sunrise, the stone scrubbed clean, the world kept turning, and the prince learned how easy it was to erase a life. He didn't feel guilt, not exactly. What he felt was weight, a solemn gravity that pressed against his shoulders, not from grief, but from understanding. He knew now that people were levers. Some moved things, some blocked things, and some had to be broken. The voices praised him, softly, like a breeze through long corridors. "Well done, Shah," they said. "Now you know what power feels like." He told no one. Not his brother, not his tutors, not even the old priest, who still lit candles in the chapel, even though no one ever prayed there anymore. The prince remained as he always had been, silent, polite, strange. But something inside him shifted. He watched people more closely, their posture, their hesitation. He listened for pauses in speech, for the second thoughts behind the first. He learned to detect lies by the way people breathed, and when someone seemed out of rhythm, too curious, too bold, too uncertain, he remembered what happened to those who stood still too long outside doors. The next death was not so clean. It was a member of the court, a cousin, distantly related by blood but not by loyalty. He had mocked the prince in a salon, his voice sticky with wine and arrogance, calling him the ghost prince. The joke had echoed through the room like a dare, and though the prince didn't respond, others watched him carefully that night, waiting to see if he would flinch. He didn't. The cousin disappeared 3 days later. He had left for a hunting trip and never returned. His horse came back bloodied and riderless. The guard said wolves, the court said fate, but the prince knew better. And the voices did too. He was dangerous, they whispered. He laughed at what he didn't understand. The prince never spoke of it, but when he walked through the grand hall and past the space where his cousin once lounged, he felt a stillness settle into the stone, like a memory swallowed whole. That was the moment the court began to fear him. Not openly. No one bowed shallower, no one crossed themselves when he entered a room, but the space around him grew, wider, emptier. People gave him a second's delay when addressing him, as if waiting to see who else would speak first. He was no longer just the prince with strange eyes and stranger habits. He had become a weight, unseen but undeniable, and still he said nothing. But he listened. He began to catalogue names, faces, voices. He remembered the way someone's hand trembled when they took wine, the way another blinked too fast when asked about their loyalties. And at night, when the palace dimmed and the walls exhaled, the voices would speak again. That one lies. She met with the envoy. He dreams of rebellion. The prince didn't order executions, not directly, but the right words, the right pauses, the right glances were enough. The machinery of fear had already begun to turn, and he merely gave it momentum. He didn't need to lift a sword. He had learned that suggestion was sharper than steel. Each death brought silence. Each silence brought control. And with each silence, the prince grew more certain. This was how a kingdom was held. Not through love, not through speeches, but through the space left behind when people vanished, through the fear that settled in their absence. And the voices, his true counsel, never questioned him. They only urged him forward. There will be more, they said. You are not finished yet. And he knew they were right. She never screamed, not once. Even as the guards dragged the blood-soaked body from the courtyard at dawn, even as they washed the stones with boiling water, the queen stood perfectly still behind the latticed window of her private chamber, hands pressed so tightly against the glass that her knuckles turned pale. The silence was not strength, it was survival. She had learned long ago that emotion, in this court, was a thing to be harvested and weaponized. Tears became rumours, outbursts became treason, and mothers who grieved too loudly often found themselves accused of madness, or worse, complicity. So she watched, and when the servants bowed as they passed, they did not meet her eyes, because everyone knew. She had given birth to the boy. She had felt him flutter beneath her ribs. She had whispered lullabies into his ears before his first tooth. She had held him when the world seemed too bright, too sharp, too loud. And she had been there when he first began to stare too long at empty corners of the room, listening to things no one else could hear. At first she had thought it was imagination, a lonely boy in a cold palace. But then came the drawings, symbols that didn't belong to any tutor's lesson, names no one had spoken aloud. And then came the voices, not from his mouth but from the places he looked, the walls, the floors, the shadows that trembled behind candlelight. She remembered the first time he looked at her and said calmly, "They don't like you." She had laughed, an automatic motherly sound, but he hadn't smiled. He had simply turned and walked away. After that, she watched him more closely, not with a mother's gaze, but with the quiet dread of a woman who realized her child might not belong to her anymore. The queen tried to speak to the king, but he had long since learned to ignore things that made him uncomfortable. He waved it away. Boys will be boys, and went back to his mistresses and petitions and petty wars. So she was left alone to hear the whispers that leaked from her son's room at night, alone to find the pages he had burned in the fireplace, pages with faces drawn in agonizing detail, each one crossed out with ink that looked far too much like blood, and alone to hear, one morning, that a servant boy had slipped and died near the prince's chambers. She didn't believe it, not for a moment. Not after the way her son had stared at the boy the day before, not after what he had muttered beneath his breath when the boy spilled tea on his sleeve, not after the way the windows seemed to hum when her son became angry. She tried to confront him. She waited until the hallway was empty, until the voices, if they were there, couldn't interrupt. She stepped into his chamber, elegant, spotless, hollow, and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing the wall. "I know what you did," she said. He didn't turn. She stepped closer. "They are not your friends, whoever they are. They are not gods. They are not protectors. They are poison." He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his eye. the look in it. Cold, old, not a boy's, not even a man's. "They protect me from people like you," he said. It felt like a knife. She wanted to scream, to grab him by the shoulders, to shake him until he remembered who he was, but she didn't move. The air in the room felt wrong, dense, like she had stepped underwater. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. "You are not well." He smiled then slowly. "I am exactly what they need me to be." She left without another word, and from that moment she understood. Her child, the one she had carried, fed, soothed, protected, was gone. Not dead, but taken. Not by assassins, not by illness, but by something older than her, deeper than the kingdom's laws, louder than the crown's authority. She watched in silence as more people vanished, as the court began to change their tone around him, as his name carried weight it had never earned. And yet she still hoped, even as she stood behind the window and watched the blood stain the stones below, even as the guards shifted their eyes away from hers, even as the palace fell quiet under the shadow of a prince who no longer smiled. She hoped that something human remained in him. But when he passed her in the corridor that night, hands folded behind his back, head tilted toward the wall, as if listening to a joke only he could hear, he didn't look at her, not once. And in that moment the Queen knew that her horror was not simply that she had lost him, it was that she might live long enough to see what he would become. The walls had always been there, silent, ornate, watching. In the early days they had merely whispered, soft, flickering murmurs beneath the rush of candlelight, a breeze that shouldn't be there, a word just on the edge of memory, the kind of sound you might dismiss in a busy palace, chalked up to drafty corridors, or servants mumbling behind doors. But for the prince, it had never been background noise. The walls were not passive to him, they spoke with intent. At first they seemed harmless, playful even. They offered advice when he struggled with his lessons. They mocked the tutors he despised. They told him which courtier had lied that morning, which servant had stolen a ring, which advisor wanted to replace the king. The voices became a secret shield, a hidden source of power in a palace where nothing was safe and no one could be trusted. And when they were right, when their whispers proved true, the prince listened more. He began to test them, leaving small traps, asking questions out loud, checking the corners of rooms for eyes that shouldn't be there. But no matter how deeply he searched, he found nothing, only marble and plaster and wood. Still the voices came, and they were never wrong. By the time he turned 16, the prince had stopped attending council meetings. He said the advisors lied, that they played chess with kingdoms, that their loyalty could be boiled down to coin and comfort. The king reprimanded him for his absence, once loudly, in front of the entire court. But the prince did not respond, he simply smiled, because the walls had already told him that the king wouldn't live much longer. The decay was slow, subtle, but real. At night, the prince slept facing the wall. Not the fire, not the window, the wall. He spoke to it like a lover, listened to it like scripture. When courtiers passed his chambers, they heard soft murmurs, monologues of strategy, vengeance and justice delivered in the stillness of candlelight. And when they asked him about it, he denied nothing. "They know more than any man alive could," he once told the queen, "because they never forget." Servants began to fear his room. Some swore they heard laughter echoing from behind the stone. Others said their ears rang when they stood too close to his door. A few claimed to have seen movement behind the walls, shadows that didn't align with any human shape. The prince did not care, or perhaps he cared too much. He began scratching symbols onto the walls with a blade, not decorative flourishes, but harsh, jagged characters, ancient, primal. No one could translate them. When a priest tried to have one removed, the prince erupted in fury and ordered him banished. "It's not yours to erase," he said. "They gave it to me." Even the queen, once the last person he looked at like a son, stopped entering his chamber, but his power grew. When an ambassador insulted him at a feast, the man died 2 days later. His body found curled in a servant's closet, eyes wide with terror. When questioned, the prince simply replied, "He listened to the wrong wall." The palace changed with him. Rooms that once sang with music fell silent. Banquets grew tense. Councillors now addressed the prince with a caution usually reserved for kings. His madness, or what others called madness, had become its own throne. And still the walls whispered. They fed him names, threats, weaknesses. They painted the world in blood and secrets. And the prince, once a clever boy with uncertain eyes, became a vessel. His gaze was sharper now, his voice colder, but it wasn't his alone. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, as if listening. Sometimes he answered questions that hadn't been asked aloud. He began sleeping less. He claimed dreams were unnecessary when the wolves told him everything. By the time the first execution was ordered by his own hand, there was no protest. The guards obeyed. The court looked away. The condemned fan, an old steward accused of spreading rumours, did not scream. He only muttered, "It's not your voice, my prince, Boatins," before the blade came down. The prince did not blink. He spent the evening alone in his chambers, humming softly, etching another symbol into the stone. The wolves had begun to win. They were no longer just advisors. They were arbiters, historians, prophets, and he no longer doubted them. He needed them, trusted them, more than any soul of flesh and blood, because the living betrayed, the living lied. But the walls, they were eternal. When the queen looked into her son's eyes one final time, on a day when the sun refused to shine through the palace windows, she realized something she'd long feared. He no longer heard the voices. They heard through him. They waited until the bells stopped ringing, until the corridors emptied of laughter, and the wine from the banquet turned bitter in their mouths, until the prince had returned to his rooms, alone as always, whispering secrets to stone. That was when they gathered, in shadows, in silence, beneath the great palace that once rang with music, now echoing only with fear. They were men of titles, women of breeding, highborn and lowborn alike, but the one thing they shared, the one thing that united them, more than loyalty to crown or country, was the growing terror in their bones, not of war, not of famine, but of a prince who stared too long at walls and smiled when he shouldn't. They had watched him grow, watched the clever boy become a stranger to his own reflection, watched as courtiers bowed too deeply and servants scurried too fast, watched the way the guards held their spears tighter when he passed, as if muscle memory alone might ward off madness. And still, none dared speak, not at first, because treason, in a place like this, is not simply a word, it's a mirror. You see your own ambition staring back at you, you feel the coldness of your own doubt, and for a long time they told themselves it would pass, that he was young, that he would outgrow it. But the walls didn't stop talking, and then came the deaths. A maid accused of entering his room at the wrong time, found drowned in the fountain, with stones tied to her feet. A captain of the guard who refused to carry out an arrest, with no name, disemboweled in his sleep. A poet, beloved by the queen, who whispered that the prince's crown should never touch his brow, hung by his own quill, inked with blood. Each death was followed by silence, a silence that said, "You saw what happened, and you'll see worse if you speak." But eventually, the silence grew too loud, and so they gathered in the crypt of St. Aurum, beneath the altar where old kings lay rotting beneath carved stone. Each conspirator had a reason. Some sought to preserve the throne, some feared for their children, and some, those with sharper eyes, simply knew what was coming. "He's not fit," said the Lord Chancellor, voice barely above a whisper. "We made excuses for too long." "It's not just madness," murmured the Dowager Countess, her hands trembling. "It's possession. He says the walls tell him who must die." "He believes it," spat a bishop. "That's enough to make it true." The Queen was not there. Her absence was its own kind of participation, her silence a permission. They spoke for hours, about the danger, the bloodshed, the slow unravelling of sanity at the heart of the realm. But no one said what they truly meant, not aloud, not until the youngest among them, a boy barely 20, finally found the courage to say what the others could not. "He has to die." The words were like a stone dropped in a still pond. Everyone looked at him. No one argued. They spoke of methods, poisons, blades, an accident during a hunt, a fall from the tower, each suggestion colder than the last. But with every word the weight grew lighter, because once treason is spoken aloud, it becomes something else, strategy. The bishop made the sign of the cross. "If the devil whispers through him," he said, "then we're not killing a prince. We're exorcising a curse." They told themselves that. They clung to it, because guilt is easier to carry when dressed in righteousness. But none of them, not even the bishop, had the courage to do it themselves. And so they agreed to send another, a trusted man, quiet, steady, the palace apothecary. He had once treated the prince for fever, and the prince had liked him. "He won't suspect," said the Chancellor. "He'll take the wine." The plot was set. The vial was prepared. A single drop, and the prince would sleep forever. No blade, no scandal, just peace, or so they thought. What they did not know, what they couldn't have known, was that the walls had already heard them. Because walls, in palaces like these, are not made of stone alone. They are made of secrets, of echoes, of long-forgotten cries. They were never built to protect kings. They were built to remember them, and the prince had spent his life listening. That night, as the conspirators left the crypt, something shifted in the air above. The prince stood in his chambers, eyes closed, palm flat against the wall, listening not to one voice, but to many. "They plot," the walls breathed. "Beneath the bones of kings," another whispered. "They chose death." The prince smiled, not with joy, but with inevitability. He did not weep, he did not rage, he simply whispered back, "Then let it be done." That night there were no voices, not in the walls, not in the air, not in the flickering silence between footsteps. For the first time since the prince was old enough to remember, the walls did not breathe their warnings. They did not whisper threats or riddles. They did not weep. They did not laugh. They were quiet, and it terrified him. He sat alone in his chamber, a half-drunk goblet of wine on the floor beside him, untouched since the afternoon. The logs in the hearth had burned down to a blue glow, shadows stretching long and unfamiliar across the floor. His eyes twitched from panel to panel, watching the same carved seams, the same cracked plaster, waiting, listening. But the walls, so faithful, so filled with secrets and hunger and ancient blood, had nothing to say. He pressed his hand against them. No vibration, no pull of breath behind stone, only stillness. He tapped them, gently at first, then harder. Nothing answered. The silence was heavier than sound. It wasn't just the walls. Outside, the halls were too still. No rustle of silk from courtiers retreating to bed. No muffled arguments between stewards and guards. No slippered feet racing past. No echoed cough from the servants' stair. Even the wind, which usually rattled the lattice glass at this hour, was gone. The entire palace felt like it had fallen into the same breathless state. He whispered, "Are you angry?" No response. He tried again. "I did what you asked. I listened. I obeyed." The walls stared back, blank and unmoved. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not like a flood, but like a trickle, cold and steady. What if the silence wasn't punishment? What if it was abandonment? What if they were gone? The prince rose unsteadily. He hadn't slept in 3 nights. The last death had rattled something loose in him. His cousin, barely older than he was, who had dared to mock the voices in court, now buried in the orchard, now forgotten. But he remembered, and the voices had praised him for it. They had praised him with laughter and the groaning of timber beams and the distant chime of something ancient and unseen. But now, nothing. Not even the smallest creak. He walked barefoot across the chamber, yanked the heavy doors open, and stepped into the corridor. Still nothing. The guards posted outside his chamber did not look up. They stood as if frozen, their faces cast in moonlight, unmoving. He moved past them, expecting resistance, but none came. The deeper into the palace he wandered, the more eerie the silence became. Paintings didn't seem to breathe anymore. Statues no longer turned their heads when he wasn't looking. Even the floor, which had once echoed footsteps like a heartbeat, gave nothing back. He turned down the corridor that led to the crypt, St. Auram's bones below. That place had always hummed with power, always thrummed with the dead. But tonight, there was no pulse, no presence, just cold marble and dust. At the altar, he knelt. "Speak to me," he begged. Still nothing. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him, didn't notice the way the air shifted. It wasn't until he felt the warmth of another body that he turned. The apothecary stood there, eyes wet with fear, holding the goblet the prince had left behind. His hands trembled. The poison was meant to already be inside him, but the prince had never touched it. The prince tilted his head. "You drank it?" The apothecary nodded. "They made me." The prince reached out, took his hand, held it gently. "You're going to die," he said. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm not." The apothecary collapsed in his arms, shaking, twitching, frothing at the mouth. The prince laid him gently on the stone floor, brushing a strand of hair from his face. For a moment he wept. For a moment he was human. And then he heard it. A breath, just one, from the wall behind the altar. It came not as a whisper, but as a sigh, long, slow, tired, and then a voice. "They are afraid." He rose to his feet. Something in his face had changed. "They tried to unmake you," the wall said. He nodded. "They failed. Then let it begin." The silence was over. The prince stepped into the corridor, the dead man at his feet. The guards turned, not to stop him, but to kneel. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, because the walls were speaking again, and this time they were louder than ever. They said his coronation was the grandest in 3 generations. The canopy was stitched with real gold, the incense imported from Alexandria, the velvet dyed with crushed beetles so rare they glimmered purple in the sun. Thousands pressed into the capital to watch the boy-turned-king ascend the marble steps. They cheered when he raised the scepter. They sobbed when the crown was placed on his head. But no one noticed how he flinched when it touched him. No one saw his fingers twitch in rhythm with voices only he could hear. He had learned by then how to wear stillness like armour, how to blink slowly when the whispers screamed, how to nod when they demanded blood, how to smile, wide, regal, patient, when the walls behind the throne trembled with unseen breath. The crown fit. But so did the madness. His first decree came before sundown. It was not one of reform or mercy or order. It was a command to empty the palace of every tapestry that depicted past kings. "They whisper lies," he said, flatly, "even when their mouths are woven shut." No one questioned him aloud, but the servants moved faster that day, and the scribes made fewer mistakes. The second decree came a week later. All mirrors everywhere in the royal city were to be destroyed. "They let the voices out," he explained. "When you sleep, they crawl through the glass." He said it gently, as if sharing a child's secret. But when a noblewoman objected, laughing nervously, calling it poetic nonsense, he ordered her to be made into a statue, literally, covered in molten silver from toes to teeth. Now she stood by the eastern gardens, eternally laughing. Madness, of course, is rarely named aloud, especially when it wears silk and gives gifts, especially when it smiles with the mouth of a saint and kills with the certainty of a prophet. And for a time, his madness was mistaken for genius. The court obeyed because it had to, because the punishments were not just swift, they were theatrical. He created roles for those he trusted, even if no one else could see them. A minister of shadows, who was never present but always feared. An ambassador to the walls, whose job was to kneel each morning and listen to what the bricks had dreamed. That position rotated frequently. Most died before their 3rd week. He dined alone, always with 5 extra chairs, one for the whisperer, one for the seer, one for the dead brother he claimed had been devoured in the womb, one for his reflection, which he insisted had escaped, and one for the silence itself. Each night he toasted them all. Each night he waited for their replies. At first his enemies thought they could wait him out, that eventually the voices would consume him from within, that the crown would slip. But the opposite happened. The more he leaned into the madness, the more control he seemed to gain. It was as if the voices, chaotic as they were, gave him clarity no sane man could possess. He made decisions no council would dare propose, then watched them succeed. He predicted storms before the court astrologers. He arrested traitors before they plotted. He eliminated debt by issuing a new currency, whose value, he claimed, came from the blood of the stones. And it worked. Even his punishments became law. They had rules, formulas. If you spoke out of turn, your tongue was braided into your hair. If you lied, your shadow was painted red for a month. And if it didn't fade, you were burned for treason. He claimed his reign was built not on fear, but on symmetry. Symmetry, he said, is the truest form of justice. Madness only terrifies the crooked. They whispered about him more than any king before, but only in rooms without corners, and only when the walls were smooth. Still, something began to shift. The madness didn't stay in the throne room. It leaked like oil through cracks in marble. Ministers began seeing shadows move where none should. Dancers heard their names in the wind. The palace cat spoke once, just once. It asked the cook to kill itself. The city changed. The people whispered, but not about him. They whispered with him. And then one morning the sky above the capital turned completely black for 7 hours. No clouds, no storm, just blackness. He stood on the balcony, smiling. "It listens," he said. By now, his advisors rarely looked him in the eyes. Some cut off their own ears. But the kingdom still functioned. Grain still moved. Roads stayed safe. The army grew. Because in his madness, he ruled with a terrifying precision. They had no name for it, not yet. But deep down, in the marrow of their bones, they all knew. Madness no longer whispered from the corners. It sat on the throne. History remembers what flatters the victors. It records the names of battles, the weight of crowns, the treaties signed in blood. But it forgets the shadows that shaped those events, the voices behind the walls, the strange laughter echoing through stone corridors when no one else was there. It forgets what does not fit neatly into the logic of kingship, diplomacy, or lineage. And so the prince who listened to the walls became, in time, a king who was erased. Not because his reign was short. He ruled for over 2 decades. Not because he failed under his rule. The economy thrived. Foreign invaders were repelled, and the treasury overflowed with silver. But because he frightened those who came after him. Because he ruled not with reason, but with something far older, far more unsettling. He ruled with conviction, born of hallucination. And conviction is contagious. The official records, what few remain, speak in vague terms. They call him eccentric, deeply spiritual, a solitary monarch. His decrees were attributed to mysterious advisors. His punishments framed as symbolic acts, misunderstood by the peasantry. The royal scribes edited his speeches so thoroughly that not a word of what he actually said survives. Even the paintings of him, those few that weren't destroyed, depict a version of him that never existed. Calm, handsome, distant, boring. But the walls remember. Some say that in the years after his death, stones in the palace still wept when touched. That in rooms where he once held court, ink would pool on its own, spelling out phrases no one dared read aloud. That one particular corridor, long since sealed, still echoed with murmured arguments, though the bricks were smooth and untouched by human hands. His name became a curse in the royal family, literally. If a child spoke it, they were made to wash their mouth with vinegar. If a noble whispered it, their title was quietly dissolved over generations, until they were commoners, without memory of their disgrace. His bloodline, too, was wiped from the family tree, as if he'd never ruled, as if he'd never lived. But he had lived, intensely, brilliantly, terrifyingly, and in the kingdom's darkest corners, some remembered him not as a madman, but as a prophet. They whispered that he had not ruled alone, that he had discovered something hidden within the palace, something sentient, something ancient, that the voices he followed had never belonged to him at all, but were part of the castle itself. Others say the palace died with him, that after his passing it grew cold, not temperature cold, but emotionally barren, that the new king sat on thrones, gave orders, built armies, but nothing ever felt alive again. The magic was gone. The walls had gone silent, and silence, as it turns out, is far more terrifying than madness. The queen, his last wife, lived another 30 years. She never remarried. She never spoke of him publicly. But every spring, on the anniversary of the black sky, she laid 5 empty plates at the royal table. No one dared ask why. No one dared remove them. His son was different, ordinary, purposefully so. He avoided the throne room, refused to wear the crown except for ceremonies, and replaced the entire interior of the castle. New floors, new tapestries, even new stones. But still the dreams came. Of footsteps in hollow halls, of voices speaking in rhyme, of a hand on his shoulder when no one was there. In the end, his reign too was short, and with each generation, the palace lost more of its memory. Eventually, the kingdom itself forgot. Not because it wanted to, but because forgetting was the only way to survive. Madness in a prince can be romanticized. Madness in a king can be spun into poetry. But madness that succeeds, madness that wins, is a threat to the entire concept of history. Because if the whispers were real, if the walls truly spoke, if the man they tried to erase had tapped into something deeper than power, then everything else, every law, every crown, every story, might be built on nothing. So they called him unfit. They buried his name in euphemism, and the next time, a child said he heard whispers behind the fireplace. The nursemaid simply smiled. "That's just the wind," she said, and turned the key in the nursery door. Centuries later, they say the palace is quiet. They say the voices died with the boy king, buried alongside his broken mind and blood-stained reign. They say the walls are just walls now, stone, mortar and silence. That reason returned to the throne. That madness faded into history, like fog in morning sun. But you know better. You came here to prove something, to stand where he stood, to see the throne he stained with fear. You tell yourself it's for research, curiosity, maybe ambition, maybe arrogance. You don't believe in ghosts, or whispers, or inherited nightmares, not yet. But when you walk through the corridor he once walked, barefoot, bleeding, eyes wide with things no one else could see, you feel it. The floor is too cold, the light too dim, the air too still. It's as if the palace holds its breath, watching you with unseen eyes. It starts the same way he did, the way he paced night after night while the voices spoke through cracks and crevices, from behind paintings and inside the mouths of marble busts. The same path he took when he ordered his uncle's execution, when he locked his sister in her rooms, when he whispered back to voices no one else could hear. And then, you hear it too. Not a voice, not exactly. A vibration behind your eyes. A wordless sound you don't understand, but it understands you. It pulls your name from the pit of your chest and places it gently in your ear. Not spoken, delivered. Your name. Like it has always known you. Like it has waited. You freeze. But you don't run. You can't. Your legs are no longer yours. You're a child again. Bare souls on frozen stone, staring into shadows that blink. Your heart pounds like it remembers something your mind does not. Like it recognizes this rhythm, this place, this pull. The voice returns. It's clearer now. It carries weight, intention, hunger. It tells you things. Names you've never heard but somehow remember. Places you've never seen but feel carved into your bones. You are being filled with something that isn't yours, and yet has always belonged to you. You try to speak but your mouth is dry. You try to move but your feet stay rooted. The walls lean in. They press against your ears, your spine, your heart. They whisper things no living man should hear. They tell you the truth that he never left, that his mind never died, that the crown did not bury him but absorbed him. That madness, once welcomed, never leaves. It hides, it waits, it finds cracks, and it returns through you, because you came here, because you listened, because now it knows your name. And then the voice gives a command. It is not a request, it does not argue, it does not plead. It is spoken the way thunder strikes, instantly, fatally, without doubt. A wordless compulsion you understand with perfect clarity. Listen, that's all it says. But it is enough. You understand now why he obeyed, why he turned against blood and kin, why he looked into a mirror and saw a crown where his face should be, why he stood in the council chamber and heard screams where others heard silence. Because the voices do not lie. They are ancient, they are patient, and now they have found you. You close your eyes, not because you want to, but because they have asked. You are not the first, you will not be the last. The walls whisper still.